Hi, thanks for tuning in today. Today I want to share some evidence for you in regards to the date of the composition of the book of Revelation. So I take the view that the book of Revelation was written prior to the fall of Jerusalem. There have been two major views that have been proposed for the date of Revelation. One would go back into the 60s or so, sometime prior to the fall of Jerusalem, and the other view would date it into the 90s. But we're going to explore about 5 reasons why you can think that the book of Revelation was written prior to the fall of Jerusalem. So let's just jump right into it. The external evidence, as far as I'm concerned, is murky. So you have people like Irenaeus who have been read in such a way to suggest a later date for the book of Revelation. However, the evidence in Irenaeus is not unambiguous. This has been covered in some detail in Kenneth Gentry's work regarding how to read Irenaeus. The Greek is a little bit ambiguous, so I don't think it's a slam dunk that Irenaeus necessarily believed in a late date. If he did, that would be good evidence for a late date, but I don't think the evidence is very clear-cut on that. However, we have other evidence, very early evidence, like the Muratorian canon, which would take a very early date for the book of Revelation, and these are pieces of literature that are pretty close in time-wise. So the Muratorian canon would be written about AD 170 or something like that. There's other ancient sources like the Syriac New Testament dating, a few hundred years, maybe 500 AD after the book of Revelation. Now, I know that sounds quite a bit of time that's separated, but when we're talking about ancient sources and ancient evidence, that's pretty ancient evidence. So there was some debate even in the early days about the composition of the book of Revelation. So I think the most important evidence that we have, because we have competing information in the ancient world from our external evidence, and I think the most important evidence that we're going to have is Scripture's self-testimony. Irenaeus, church fathers, all those people could be fallible, but if the Scripture itself gives its own witness about the date of the book of Revelation, then we need to take that more seriously than we do external evidence. So one of the things that I think in regards to this that we can think about is what sort of atmosphere. So let's take the first piece of evidence, okay? There's no good evidence anymore that's widely regarded as very solid evidence that there was a serious persecution in the time of Domitian. So why does that matter? What difference does it make? If you're taking a late date and you take the book of Revelation seriously and you believe the book of Revelation's testimony about itself, then it's a problem if there isn't a widespread persecution under Domitian. Mark Wilson, who has written for the Biblical Archaeology Society, has an excellent article on this. I'll put a link in the description. But he says the fake news that Domitian instigated a severe persecution of Christians and that his claim to be master and God provoked this persecution needs to be removed from our facts about the early church. The idea that there was a widespread severe persecution of the church, that idea, that it happened under Domitian, that idea is widely regarded as fake news these days. Now, why is that a problem? The problem is that the book of Revelation testifies that this is a time where they're about to face severe persecution. The witness that was given to those 7 churches of Asia, I'll give you one example from Revelation 2:10. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Or again in Revelation 3:10, Because thou didst keep the word of my endurance, I also will keep thee from the hour of the trial that is about to come upon all the world, to try those dwelling upon the earth. There's a trial that these 7 churches are about to come to, an hour of temptation and trial that's about to hit them, and it's coming at them. If there were no persecution, major or severe persecution under Domitian, then this would poke a big hole in the credibility of the book of Revelation, because Scripture is testifying that these Christians are about to face severe persecution, severe trial. Now, in contrast, when you think about Nero, Nero was the Hitler of the ancient world. He was the person that when people think of tyrant, they think of evil, they think of debauchery, they think Nero. Nero was known as a persecutor, not just a persecutor of just random people, but a persecutor of Christians. This is a well-known fact. And it is interesting, however you interpret the book of Revelation, whatever view you come to, however you approach it, whatever one of the major views that you take. Also, I don't think it's insignificant that when you put Nero into Hebrew letters, his name comes up to 666. But regardless of how you see that, Nero, a persecution under Nero makes much more sense. And even so, the atmosphere around the late 60s really fits the tone of the book of Revelation much better than in the 90s. You'll recall from your ancient history course that this is the time where you have the year of the 4 emperors, and Rome itself falls into civil war, and it's just chaos in the Roman world at this time. And in particular, it's chaos for people and Jewish people who have looked to the temple as the center of their worship, because the Romans come and destroy the temple at this time. So Roman civil war, huge unrest, persecution, and one of the worst emperors, probably the worst emperor that Rome ever had. This fits the setting and tone of the book of Revelation far more than the much more tranquil period under Domitian. Secondly, we would point out that there's no mention of the fall of the temple in the book of Revelation. Now, this, granted, could be sort of an argument from silence, but it's a very big silence. For the Christians, for Jewish people and Christians, the fall of Jerusalem is an earth-shaking event. It's a huge event, and it's one that Jesus had predicted. So for the book of Revelation to just let that go unnoticed is a pretty startling omission. But even more so, it seems like we have an indication that the temple is still standing at the time that the book of Revelation was written. If you look at Revelation chapter 11, John sees a temple, and it's still standing, and he's told to rise and measure the temple. Now, you might say, well, maybe that temple represents something, or it's symbolic of something. Okay, fair enough. If you want to go that way, it's out of the scope of this video. But he still sees the temple there, and there's no indication that it's fallen. In fact, he says that the holy city is going to be, shall be, future tense, trodden under the feet of the Gentiles for 42 months. Now, however you take the 42 months, it's still future from John's time. That seems like an odd thing to say if the temple had already fallen. Even more so, when you compare Luke 21 and Revelation chapter 11, and you put them side by side and see what they say together, you'll see that the parallels are almost impossible to ignore. Revelation 11:2 says, "But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months." While Luke 21 says, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." So, the fact that the temple appears in the book of Revelation as still standing cries out for an early date. In fact, liberal scholars really have trouble with this, especially the ones who want to hang on to a late date. they can't deny the fact that Revelation 11 seems to picture the temple as still standing. So there's been people who have taken a late date and an early date. They say, oh, well, this part of Revelation was composed earlier, and the rest of the book of Revelation was composed much later, to try to cobble it all together. But if you're conservative and you think that the book of Revelation is an organic whole, then I think you've got good grounds on the fact that the temple was still standing when Revelation 11 was written to believe that the book of Revelation was indeed composed prior to the fall of Jerusalem. I would also point to the uncanny parallels between the book of Revelation and Josephus. So you can hold Josephus up in one hand, the book of Revelation up in the other hand, and you will see striking verbal similarities, so much so that sometimes you think, if you didn't know that Josephus was a first century Jew and not a first century Christian, you would think that Josephus sometimes was taking lines out of the book of Revelation. It's so uncanny that, again, sometimes some liberal scholars have said, wow, there are these floating traditions that are going on in the first century that John has picked up on, and then Josephus also picks up on them. But again, if you're a conservative and you think the book of Revelation is a real revelation from God, it's not just some cobbled together oral traditions that are floating around in the first century, but a direct revelation from God, then these uncanny parallels between what Josephus says about the fall of Jerusalem and what John says that the Lord showed him, it seems almost unmistakable that they're talking about some of the same events. Now, let me hasten to say, I don't think that all of the book of Revelation is fulfilled. I'm not a hyper-preterist. I still think the coming of the Lord is in our future, and I think Revelation can speak into our future. I take a typological approach. But the fact that the book of Revelation has so many parallels to what happened in the fall of Jerusalem as documented by our best witness to the fall of Jerusalem, I don't think that evidence can be ignored. So I'd also point to the count of kings in the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation gives us a measure by which we can date it, because he says there's 5 kings which have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. Now, the majority view among scholars has been these are Roman emperors. Now, you might take a different view on this, and this is beyond the scope of this video to really argue all of this out in detail. But suffice it to say, if you start counting down from the first Roman emperor, Julius Caesar, and work your way down to the 6th king, so you go Julius Caesar, Augustus, and on down, the 6th king, the one who now is, would be Nero. Now, if you want to start the count at Augustus, because there's a little bit of debate in the ancient literature whether you should start it at Julius Caesar or Augustus. I think the weight of the evidence, we should probably start it at Julius Caesar. But regardless, if you started at Augustus, that gets you down to Galba, Nero's successor, and still you are before the fall of Jerusalem. So I think Revelation gives us its own best indicator about what time period we're dealing with. Finally, I would point to the fact that the book of Revelation, over and over again, tells us that the things that are portrayed in it are about to happen. The time is at hand. The time is near. One person, I think it was Douglas Wilson, he says it's almost like the book of Revelation is saying this thing is coming at you like a freight train. And that's the sense. There's this imminence to it. It's about to happen. It's right at the door. It's right here. In point of fact, you can look at the messages that are given to the 7 churches, and it's very clear that these instructions are for them. Now, I don't want to say that I think that everything in the book of Revelation has been completely fulfilled. I think there's parts of Revelation that haven't been fulfilled, and I think we can take an approach to the book of Revelation which will allow it to speak into our future as well. But if we read it in such a way that it has no relevance for its first century audience, then I think we're doing the book a disservice. So it's hard to see how, if the book were written in the 90s, that it could have as much relevance as it would have if it were being written right at that crucial juncture of the Roman Empire where it looked like the whole empire was about to collapse on itself. Right at that time, when Nero is launching this major persecution against the church, and the leading apostles like Peter and Paul are killed, and then Jerusalem itself is about to be destroyed. And then John has this vision where he sees a new Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven. I think the timing fits an early date much better than it does a late date. And for these reasons and many more, I think that the book of Revelation was written prior to the fall of Jerusalem.